I'm going to talk about American transnationalism. Forces promoting global governance represent a serious actor, a driver, a player in world politics today. Transnationalism or globalism has, one, an ideology, and two, a social material base. It also has a strong American wing. The ideology is utopian, the age-old dream of worldwide peace and prosperity under a benevolent global regime. It's bipartisan. Democrat Anne Marie Slaughter, head of policy and planning at the State Department in the Obama administration, declared, quote, "Transnational networks can perform many of the functions of a world government, legislation, administration, and adjudication, without the form, thereby creating a global rule of law." So not a world government, but global governance. Republican Richard Haass held the same exact position as Slaughter under President George W. Bush. He was head of policy planning at State. Haass is currently the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Haass has stated, "It's time to rethink sovereignty." He argued that, quote, "Sovereignty is not only becoming weaker in reality, but it needs to become weaker." In 2008, Robert Kagan, then advising presidential candidate John McCain, declared, this is a direct quote, "The United States should not oppose but welcome a world of pooled and diminished national sovereignty." Now, the material base of the transnationalist is housed in many institutions, including certainly the leadership of the United Nations, and bureaucrats from international organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. It includes judges from the International Criminal Court and the European Court of Justice. It includes the elites of the European Union, which is a model for global governance or transnational governance. It includes international NGOs, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace. It includes the Davoisie, the global corporate leaders who attend the World Economic Conference in Davos, Switzerland. There's a strong American presence in the forces of global governance, including leading foundations, Ford and Rockefeller, the academic community, and the American Bar Association, which advocates the global rule of law, and of course, among leading American global corporations. In fact, the vice president of Coca-Cola declared, quote, "We are not an American company," unquote. Imagine that. Coca-Cola is not an American company. An American CEO of one of the world's largest hedge funds stated that if the global economy lifts 4 people in China into the middle class and 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's, quote, "not such a bad trade." Now, Samuel Huntington described this process as the denationalization of American corporate elites. Most significantly, under the American nation state, under the Obama administration, promoted transnationalism and weakened democratic sovereignty. Obama told the United Nations in 2016, quote, "We have bound our power to international institutions. I am convinced that in the long run, giving up freedom of action, binding ourselves to international rules over the long term enhances our security," unquote. But the Brexit referendum, the election of Donald Trump, and the rise of conservative democratic nationalists throughout the West and the world has challenged the global governance project. It's been seriously challenged, you might say, for the first time in a long time. It appears that the arch of history has been altered. So what is this conflict between democratic national sovereignty and transnational progressivism or globalism? What's it all about? It's about the oldest question in politics. Who should rule and on what basis? Who makes the rules that we are governed by? Our conference program states that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, many American conservatives, quote, have grown increasingly attached to the vision of a global rules-based liberal order that would bring peace and prosperity to the entire world while attenuating the independence of nations. Well, let's examine the post-1989 global rules-based liberal order. The fall of the Berlin Wall appeared to many conservatives as a consolidation of the West's Cold War victory, and thus the building of a Reagan-Thatcher global order based on expanding liberal democracy and free markets. But the rules in the rules-based liberal order began to change. In the 1990s, the United Nations landmine treaties and the establishment of the International Criminal Court were enacted by globalist forces against the sovereignty concerns of American statesmen. 19 years ago, in September 2000, John Bolton, in a University of Chicago Law Journal article, declared, he warns, in fact, of a coming conflict between, his words, globalists and Americanists. And Bolton argued we must take global governance seriously as a threat to American democratic sovereignty. A decade later, the Obama administration, in the name of the liberal global order, was strong-arming democratic nation states into adhering to progressive social policies concerning radical feminism, abortion, LGBT, and gender issues. Meanwhile, the European Union forced the removal of democratically elected leaders in Italy and Greece, and led by Germany, facilitated mass migration from the developing world without the consent of the peoples of democratic nation states in Europe. It appears that the rules have changed as the liberal global order envisioned by Reagan-Thatcher conservatives has morphed into the transnational progressive order of Obama and Merkel. In a rules-based global order, the crucial question, of course, is what? Who makes the rules? Now, we're always reassured by the American foreign policy establishment. Don't worry, Americans and their democratic allies will be making the rules. Don't worry about it. Yes, American elites are going to play a big role in the formation of global rules. They already have. So let's listen to what they're saying. A leading international relations, that's IR, international relations, supporter of global governance, Columbia professor G. John Eikenberry, asks, quote, how do nation states reconcile the international liberal vision of increasing authority above the nation state, where there's a sharing and pooling of sovereignty, with domestic liberal democracy built on popular sovereignty, unquote. Then Eikenberry admits, quote, this is the unsolved problem in the liberal international project. Eikenberry's answer is buried in his book, The Liberal Leviathan. You got to search in the footnotes, but it's there. He cites American IR international relations professors Robert Cohane and Joseph Nye. Their argument is that national democracies cannot be relied upon because they disregard the interests of foreigners. The United States and Israel are explicitly mentioned by Cohane as offenders in this regard. Well, given the limitations of democracy and democratic sovereignty, American IR specialists contend that the legitimacy of the rules-based order lies with, quote, external epistemic communities and external epistemic actors. You got that? External epistemic actors, presumably global experts in international law, human rights, the environment, gender equity, and the like. Now, the American leadership class actually is crucial to the success of the global governance project. American submission to global authority would have to be voluntary, and that indeed is the dream of American transnationalists, for America to provide leadership in first creating and then submitting to the rules of a supranational legal regime. This is what the American Bar Association means when it advocates the global rule of law. This is what Robert Kagan meant when he declared that the United States should not oppose, but welcome a world of pooled and diminished national sovereignty. This is what President Bill Clinton meant when he told Stroll Talbot that, quote, we have to build a global social system for a future in which America was no longer the leading power, unquote. And this is what President Barack Obama meant when he told the United Nations that by binding ourselves to international institutions and by giving up freedom of action and binding ourselves to international rules, America would actually enhance its security. Thus, in the utopian vision of the transnationalists, the American caterpillar is transformed into the global governance butterfly. For decades, conservative thinking has ignored the globalist challenge. The good news is that the Trump administration is taking seriously the conflict between democratic sovereignty and global governance. It's taking it very seriously. During his United Nations speech in 2017, President Trump mentioned sovereignty more than 20 times. In his speech to the UN in 2018, President Trump declared, quote, sovereign and independent nations are the only vehicles where freedom has ever existed and democracy has ever endured. So we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all. We reject the ideology of globalism and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Now, Secretary of State, that was the President of the United States. The Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, speaking in Brussels, in the belly of the beast, declared, quote, our mission is to reassert sovereignty, reform the liberal international order, and we want our friends to help us and exercise their sovereignty as well. Pompeo's speech was entitled, quote, restoring the role of the nation state in the liberal international order. In other words, the liberal global order has moved too far away from the ideal of sovereignty. It needs to be changed. It needs to be reformed. Months later, Pompeo told the Claremont Institute, quote, countries all over the world are rediscovering their national identities, and we are supporting them. The wave of electoral surprises that has swept from Britain to the United States all the way to Brazil, unquote. So that was Pompeo. Well, today, we are witnessing the reawakening of a national conservatism that has been dormant, but has always been present. It's always been just beneath the surface. To answer the question posed by this conference in the official program, national sovereignty is not a usurper of political conservatism, but is essential to the survival, not only of conservatism, but of the democratic nation state. So this is an existential conflict. The old conservative formula that essentially ignored transnational progressivism, they essentially ignored the challenge externally. They also ignored the challenge internally, the challenge from identity politics and multiculturalism. These two challenges have told us that the old conservative formula is simply not adequate to face up to the contemporary threats from progressive left liberalism. National conservatism is needed to frame the core issues, which are the external challenge from globalism that I've just discussed, and the closely related internal challenge from identity politics, multiculturalism that others will soon be discussing, and I'm very anxious to hear those discussions. On both fronts, externally and internally, on both of these fronts, we are involved in a conflict, an existential conflict that will determine not simply the direction of politics, but the existence of the democratic nation state in America, in Britain, the West, and throughout the world. Thank you.